Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Commissioner Chronicles on the DLF YouTube channel. This is episode 8, and today I am joined by my friend, my lovely commissioner of many leagues, Ryan McDowell. How's it going tonight, Ryan?
Going well. How are you, Nathan?
Good, and it's not even nighttime. I'm used to having guests at night, so I always say tonight, but we're recording during the day. Not that that matters to you YouTube viewers, but today, episode 8, we're going to be focusing on contract leagues. And obviously, Ryan is known for his contract league, Kitchen Sink. So we will be talking about Kitchen Sink rules from the contract perspective, but we'll also talk about other ways you can do contract leagues. And so we're going to try and walk through commissioners, how they can, go about doing contract leagues, different rules you can implement, and how that affects various things. So with contract leagues, kind of the first question that you have, the first thing you have in the bylaws here is contract years. Now, one thing I will differentiate, because I think that you and I have more knowledge on contract years that aren't salary cap. So yes, we'll talk about in Kitchen Sink, you have a cap of 60 years, but you wouldn't really consider Kitchen Sink a salary cap league, right?
No, not at all. And
yeah,
I mean, if you're playing a salary cap league, obviously your cap is more about your salary, not the contract year. So that's one big difference.
Yeah. So we'll be covering contract leagues, but the cap isn't a salary cap. It's just the cap of the number of years that you can have, on your team. So when you're deciding how many contract years you want to have, what are some things you keep in mind? Is it your roster size? Is it how quickly you want people to hit free agency? So just we can start with the roster, then we can go to individual players. So how did you decide 60 contract years for Kitchen Sink?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you have to consider is your roster size. I've always preferred larger rosters in my dynasty leagues, whether they're contract leagues or not. And prior to making the Kitchen Sink leagues, I'd played in one other contract league, and basically the rosters were a little bit smaller. I believe we had 22 players maybe, and when we started Kitchen Sink, I think we had 25. And basically, I just kind of took those numbers from that league and amped them both up just a little bit. I knew I wanted more players, a larger roster size. So I gave a few more contract years. But I mean, to me, that's a lot of what making a successful league is just kind of stealing from other leagues that have worked well.
Yeah. And I do think that when you're deciding this number, it is one of those things that you can't really change year to year, because there's so many things that go into it. So that when you're making this decision as a commissioner, it's one of those things like, okay, this is for good. And if you change it anytime soon, it would be something like, okay, we talk about when you transition from one QB to Superflex, which neither of us have really done. But if you're going to do that, you kind of have to give some room in the form of time. If you're going to expand your contract years over the course of a league, I feel like that's something like, okay, hey, we're going to expand from 60 to 65, and you give like a 2-year notice for that type of thing.
Absolutely. It would be a big change. And over the years, I think we're in year 7 or 8 of Kitchen Sink leagues. And over the years, a lot of things have changed. We've expanded Taxi Squad. We've expanded the overall rosters. But that 60 contract years has stayed the same. Yep.
And so the next thing, once you decide as the commissioner, how many contract years you want to allot, then you decide, okay, what kind of contracts can you give to players? So in Kitchen Sink, it's between 1 and 4. I've seen up to 7. I've seen some crazy numbers in terms of contracts, but I do think that when you set the cap at 4 years in terms of an individual player on one contract, that does promote some churning involved, that really only the best of the best players are going to get those 4-year deals. And that, shows that, okay, after that 4 years, and we'll talk about how players hit free agency in a little bit. But do you think that 4 years is that sweet spot of you can keep the player for a long enough time, but also you're not just keeping them forever?
Right. I think it is. And I mean, depending on which position you want to look at, we could, there would be some differences there. Giving a 4-year contract to a running back might be essentially all of their, real NFL production or their value. So I think it's a good mix. I've actually never seen leagues go up to 7 years, as you mentioned. That would be a challenge. One thing with this league when I was making it, because it is pretty in depth overall, I felt like some of the rules needed to be in place, honestly, to protect owners from themselves. If you're handing out a ton of 7-year contracts, that's not going to look good, down the road.
Yeah, that's actually something that I talked about with John Bosch with auctions, how I prefer not to allow trading of auction dollars during the startup, but also I force teams to have a full roster at the end of the startup auction. And he is of the frame of mind that he's not a babysitter, and he thinks that people should be able to handle themselves. But I do agree that whether it's contract or any other format, there is a bit of protecting owners from themselves.
Yeah, and I get John's point of view on that as well. Especially, I mean, it, like a lot of things, it comes down to the group of players, of managers in your league. And if you know they've played in that type of league before, they have that experience, then you can definitely take off some of those training wheels. In this case with Kitchen Sink, especially when we were first starting, I mean, honestly, there weren't any leagues like this. I mean, there were leagues that had some of these aspects, but I think this was pretty new as far as taking all of those things and throwing them together.
So next, in terms of contract league, we have a taxi squad. We have discussed on other platforms about how, for the most part, taxi squads don't make sense outside of contract leagues. Taxi squad is really the only spot that a contract league is the only spot that a taxi squad makes sense, because you don't have to give the person a player a contract immediately. You can save those contract years that you would have given, a 4-year deal to N'Keal Harry. Now you get a year to decide, okay, do I really want to give a 4-year deal to N'Keal Harry? But also, just in general, that is a way to just save the guy. If you're rebuilding, you don't want to use that first year of Saquon Barkley. Okay, I'd rather have years 2 through 5 of Saquon Barkley. So with a taxi squad, do you have any opinions on it being past year one? I personally prefer, because you can see that R tag on MFL. So I like saying, okay, the taxi squad's just for rookies, just for devies in the event of a devy league. But for now, we're just talking about rookie with contract leagues. So with a taxi squad, it's just rookies, right?
Yeah, I would like to limit it to rookies, and as you mentioned, in the KS League specifically, they are Devy leagues. So if your league is a Devy league, I think limiting it to Devies and rookies is the way to go. But overall, I agree with you. Unless you're playing in a contract league or a Devy league, then I don't see the point to even having a taxi squad. I would just rather expand the rosters by 1 or 2 or 5, however large your taxi squad might be.
Mm-hmm. And then next on the list is a minimum. I don't think that I've ever seen this encountered personally. Maybe you have, but have you ever had to police an owner for not having the minimum 40 contract years, especially now that we've expanded to 30 roster spots?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, sometimes that comes up. You might see that in the off season before we assign new contracts, but it's more of an in-season rule there, as it mentions. I think it says during the regular season. So no, I don't think so. And honestly, it's one of those rules that is not. I guess it's not automatically enforced on my fantasy league like a lot of rules are. So there definitely could have been a situation where maybe that happened and slipped by me. Maybe I wasn't checking that as closely as I should have. But with 30-man active rosters and the ability to go up to 60, I don't think anybody's ever gone under 40.
All right. So next thing on the docket we have is trades. And this is an interesting one because I have a general rule in my leagues that aren't contract leagues that you can't just trade a player for nothing. Well, in the middle of the season last season in Kitchen Sink 4, I traded Antonio Brown on a 4-year contract for nothing. And in a traditional, normal league, that doesn't seem like a fair trade. Whereas in a contract league, I just wanted to get that 4-year contract off my books so I didn't have to hit that penalty that we'll discuss in a little bit. But I do think that it's important to just know that it's legal to trade in a contract in most contract leagues, and I would advocate for it being legal in all contract leagues, that you can trade a player for nothing as a way of getting rid of a contract that you no longer want on your team.
Absolutely. I mean, when you make a trade, you want to get something out of it. You want to get some benefit to your team. And in most cases, in most leagues, that means getting a player you like, maybe getting an upgrade or a draft pick, whatever it might be. But in a contract league, that might just be some flexibility, losing the years, as you mentioned. And honestly, I do that all the time. And sometimes I've even had to pay a draft pick or some blind bid money or something like that to even get that player off my roster. So not only am I trading the player for nothing, I'm paying the other manager to take him from me.
Or sometimes they'll take him for a ham sandwich. So
sometimes.
Yes. All right. So next we'll go on to the penalties. I do think this is one of the more difficult parts of being commissioner of a contract league, is being on top of the contracts of dropping players. First, as the commissioner, you have to decide what the penalty is going to be. And as you can see in these bylaws, Ryan has his outlined very clearly here. But unfortunately, as we talked about how some things are not always supported by your league site, it isn't supported to where it shows, okay, let's say I drop Antonio Brown in a 4-year contract. It's not going to say in that email, oh, by the way, Antonio Brown was a 4-year contract, therefore Nathan gets a 3-year penalty. So I know it's a bit of it for you is on the honor system. You have a thread of dropped contracts, but what are your thoughts? Is there a good way to police contract penalties? And also, is there any other type of penalty that you've considered other than just your standard, basically taking away the number of years that you dropped?
Yeah, there's not a good way, at least not one that I've found. As you mentioned, it's not an automated process. So it is on the commissioner to basically check every drop that is made. Because in my leagues, you can drop a player on a 1-year contract at no penalty. So we want to allow for that roster flexibility that you can add and drop players from the waiver wire without being that strict. And honestly, the drop penalties that I have here compared to other leagues are not very strict at all. These are, I would say these are more lenient if you're kind of looking at a scale. But it's really just up to the commissioner to monitor those drops. And then if you do notice that a player with a multiple year contract has been dropped, whether you track that in a Google Doc, whether you list it on the message board, now you just have to remember that Nathan has 59 years available instead of 60. And it's not an easy process. So because of that, I have considered other options. I've considered, we call it AP money in the kitchen sink leagues, but it's basically fab money, and it has some other uses throughout the off season as well. But I've considered basically an AP money penalty if you drop that player. That would be a little bit easier to track and to implement on MFL. Haven't gone to that yet at this point though. So, I mean, like everything else, you just try to stay on top of it as best as you can. But again, there's probably some that have slid through the cracks for me.
Yeah, and one thing that does kind of get talked about, which is somewhat related to this, which I've never seen implemented, and if I've seen implemented it, I haven't seen it implemented well. It's trading of contract years. I've seen people talk about basically trading for cap space or trading for contract years, and I haven't seen a league that's allowed that, mostly because it's so hard to do. Because when you put in your contract cap, so Ryan puts in 60 contract years for kitchen sink, there's no way for him to say, okay, Ryan's contract cap is 60, Nathan's is 59 if I had traded away a contract year. So that's one of the reasons why if you're considering doing a trading of contract years, that has to all be done manually, because you can't adjust each individual player's contract years like you can their fab budget or their auction budget. You can adjust those things for each person, but not their contract years.
Yeah, in kitchen sink leagues and really in just about all of my leagues, I try to make everything tradable. I want to give the managers as many assets as possible to work with and to make deals with. So I would love to add that rule. I think that would be that would be great. Maybe maybe even a game changer for some. But as you said, until there's some options on how to do that flexibly across the different managers, then yeah, it's probably not going to happen.
So now let's move to expiring contracts. Obviously, the most important part about a contract league is that when those players expire, they become an asset. And for the kitchen sink leagues, you have three ways that you can keep a pending free agent. And that's the restricted free agent, which we'll go into in a little bit. And we have the franchise player and the transition player. Franchise and transition player are basically the same thing. They just have, for the purposes of a contract league, they're the same thing. They have different costs associated with using those assets. But when you're commissioning a contract league, that's one of the most important things is figuring out, can people retain their players that go to 0-year contracts, and if so, how? So basically, how did you go about creating those three different versions of ways to retain a player in the kitchen sink leagues?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's a huge piece, a huge decision that you're making as a commissioner, and it really comes down to: do you want your league to slant towards a dynasty league, or do you want it to slant towards a redraft or a keeper league? And for me, being a dynasty guy, I want it to be more like a dynasty league. So I want it to be easier for teams to retain their good players. And obviously you can't do that with everyone. As you said, there's limited paths to keeping a player. So if you have 5 or 6 or 10 expiring contracts, you're not keeping all of those guys. But I want you to be able to keep your best player and maybe even your best 2 players. So what I did because of that is I did give the multiple options. You can have 2 restricted free agents plus the franchise and the transition player. So a way to keep up to 4 players, and the cost associated with keeping those are, I think, relatively inexpensive. So that, to me, that just kind of helps the contract league slant a little more towards a dynasty league.
Yeah, that makes sense. And certainly if you want to be more of a redraft, it's an option to say there's no way to retain. Once a 4-year contract is up, that player goes to the auction. And that's a way that guarantees that Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson are going to end up going to some sort of auction. Whereas in the kitchen sink leagues, if you have Patrick Mahomes, you could theoretically franchise tag him every year until he retires. And that might actually be a good decision. The one negative, in terms of, if we're talking about just kitchen sink here, the one negative of using the franchise tag or the transition tag is that it's a 1-year deal. Whereas the RFA, if I re-sign Patrick Mahomes, or if I tag Patrick Mahomes with the RFA, he goes for $2,000 in the AP auction. I then can say I keep Patrick Mahomes for 4 years, and I don't have to deal with losing him for 4 years. Whereas if you franchise tag him, it's like, okay, I'll deal with this again next year.
Yeah, you're just kicking the can down the road on that one. So the tags are good in that you can't lose the player. You have no risk of someone outbidding you or taking the player off your roster in any way. But as you said, it is just a 1-year deal for both the franchise and transition tags.
All right, let's move on to the RFA auction, which is probably the most complicated, but also the most fun part about the kitchen sink leagues is that's when you could see a Patrick Mahomes. That's when you can see a top end asset, which in a normal dynasty league, those players never hit a waiver wire. And in a contract league, this is the version of a waiver wire, and that's the RFA or the UFA, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But the RFA is really where you see the best players. And as kitchen sink has evolved, this has been a development this year, and this is something that you can change as the league develops, and you see what players are going for in different auctions, and whether it's a fair compensation for losing a player or for getting a player. And so, what you're looking at now is the RFA compensation for all AP dollars. Basically, on the left side, your winning bid is the AP, and then this is either rookie and or Devy compensation. for those that don't know, Kitchen Sink in particular, each team starts with 1,000 AP. So in order for a player to go for 3,000 AP, basically you have to trade for two players worth of 100% budgets. So you'll see often even the highest of bids will end up in this 1,000 to 2,000 range at the most. But we've had, I think the record was 29999. So, but anyways, as far as just talk about more of a broad contract perspective, how do you go about finding fair compensation for losing an RFA or even, bidding on an RFA?
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, it's something that has evolved over the years. The original form of this chart stopped at $1,000 because that was the full allotment, as you said, of bidding money that each team had. So in the early stages of the league, I didn't see a need to go above that, and at that point, the compensation that you were getting, if you let that $1,000 player go, it's there in the middle of the chart. You were getting, let's see, I think you were getting 606 rookie dollars in return for that. I think that was the same, Nathan. I'm kind of.
I think it was 303.
Yeah, was it 303? Okay, that's right. So yeah, we've had to adjust up because, as Nathan mentioned there were a couple of bidding wars, and Nathan, you were involved in one of those for sure. Yes. That both sides, both the manager trying to retain the player, the manager trying to steal that restricted free agent, they were both trading for AP money, and it became a very expensive proposition to really to get involved with from either side, and there were going to be probably some hurt feelings on that, because you trade for so much and then you still don't get the player, or you trade for all this money and it's not enough and you lose the player. So basically that forced us to look at some changes here. And I think it's pretty costly to steal that player away or to win that player via RFA. And like I said, I want this to slant towards a dynasty league, meaning you're able to keep more players. So I want it to be expensive. What I ultimately decided, though, with this, when I made this chart, that there had to be a little kind of balancing act. So starting next year, I actually implemented a rookie tax. So if you retain the player, it's not just matching and saying, yes, I'll give up my 1,000 and I can give Patrick Mahomes a new 4-year deal. You're also going to have to give up a percentage of that rookie money. So if $1,000 bid for Mahomes would equate to 606 rookie dollars, you're going to give up, I think we settled on 20%, Nathan. I think that's right.
I have no idea.
I need to go back and check that, but you're going to give up a percentage of that 606 to the other manager. So if Nathan was coming for my Patrick Mahomes and he traded for a lot of money, he focused on that player and ignored other restricted free agents in hopes of getting him, he doesn't go away empty-handed. He gets something for his time and effort, and it's a little tougher for me to keep the player.
Yeah, and talking about contract leagues in general here, when you're deciding what you want to do for an RFA, if you want to do an RFA or what you want to do for tags, you are kind of just deciding how much of a dynasty league do I want this to be? How easy do I want it to be to retain players? Do I want it to be an RFA auction with the best players and they're changing hands and things like that? And I think that even with this, that Kitchen Sink, we want that you / the whole league wants to be able to say, I can keep Patrick Mahomes forever. It might cost me at some point once every 4 years, but it gives you the opportunity to keep the players that you really want to keep while also having some movement on the teams that a traditional contract league would provide you. So when you're the commissioner, you have to decide how much movement do you want and how difficult do you want it to be to lose a player, how difficult do you want it to be to gain a really good player. And I do think that the more difficult you make it to get a really good player, the better it is for the league.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we said, that really is the the biggest decision, because essentially all contract leagues are basically keeper leagues. Honestly, I mean, to me, the strict definition of dynasty is you can keep all your players forever if you want. And in a contract league, that's not going to be the case. So making that decision of, do I want this to be more like a redraft league, more like a dynasty? That's really going to kind of gauge all the other decisions that you make.
And the last part of a contract league, when you have these tags and these RFAs, the last part really is that unrestricted free agency auction. And in the kitchen sink leagues, we use an AP. Oh, this was the one thing I did want to talk about with you. In two of my leagues that are like, they aren't your traditional contract leagues. They're league with no names, which I'll go into on a future episode, I'm sure. But the one thing we do is that we don't have separate currencies. We don't have an AP money, a rookie money, a Devy money. We just have auction dollars. And so whatever the player you lose goes for, you get that much money. Have you ever considered that? Do you think that's a viable option for a contract league? Or do you think that it's just better to have the different currencies?
I prefer the separate pools of money for a couple of reasons. And I know, doing essentially a bankroll league where you have just the one pot of money. I know those are definitely popular and have been successful as well. Both yours and I think Scott's Capitalist Pigs are like that as well. That gives managers a lot of freedom as far as if they don't want to focus on the Devy auction, they can just spend their money elsewhere. Where in kitchen sink, you're kind of locked in. You've got this Devy money, and if you don't want to use it, if you don't want to focus on that part of the game, then you have to trade it. So I like the flexibility that comes from leagues like the one you're describing. But for me, having the separate banks of money, again, just gives more tradable assets. So if I'm trying to work a trade with you, maybe I know I can trade you Devy money. I can trade you Devy spots. I could trade you rookie money, AP money. There's just it just results in more assets to be able to trade.
Yeah, when you have different currencies, there end up being trades involving the two currencies. I've traded Devy spots for AP money. I've traded AP spots for Devy money. It's gone both ways, or any sort of the ways of the three different currencies, really. But the one benefit I talk about with using the one currency, and once you lose a player, is I feel like it's a little bit more concrete that if the player goes for 250 and I get 250 back, that is a little less complicated than the table of, okay, if this player goes for 1,000, then I get 606. Not that it's overly complicated, but in your brain, it's like, okay, I lost a player worth 250. Now I get 250 to spend on a player. But that's more of just oversimplifying it. So let's wrap up with some UFA talk. UFA is basically every player that wasn't RFA'd or tagged and was an expiring contract. What are some benefits you like about the UFA? Is there some things that you've considered changing or adding to the UFA to make it more interesting?
Yeah, as you said, UFA is just kind of all the leftovers. So any rookies that were not picked up in the rookie auction, UFA is essentially our first waiver run of the year, except instead of using blind bid waivers, we do the open auction. So no, I don't think I've had any thoughts on changing anything there. You do always seem to see a strong player slip through. You might think that after all of the other auctions, because it is usually the last thing we do each off season and before the season kicks off, you might think that it is just kind of the drags and the leftovers. But Nathan, the one we're participating in right now, Tyler Higbee is there. Rob Gronkowski was in there. You had a starting quarterback in Tyrod Taylor. So there's always a few really strong options that slip through for whatever reason. So that's actually one thing that has worked pretty well, I think.
Yeah, and one thing that I've rarely implemented this, and this is more strategy talk in a contract league than commish talk, but I have had thoughts, and I've done this a couple of times actually, is when I have a player on a 1-year deal. So when you drop a player on a 1-year contract, there's no penalty. Now the UFA auction in kitchen sink and in most contract formats, UFA is your last chance to do a player on a multi-year contract. So if I have a player that I like that I don't think is going to go for very much in the UFA auction, I drop him and then I bid on him myself, and then he becomes an assignable contract. Now, certainly a player of that caliber isn't really ever getting a 4-year deal, but occasionally I'll drop a player and then re-win them just so I can give them a 2 or 3 year deal. Have you seen any of that personally?
I've not. I'm glad you told me about that, though. I think it's a great strategy. You do kind of see that. You actually see that more in salary cap leagues, where you might have a player whose salary has become, out of line with what his current production is. Maybe you don't want him off your roster. You just want a shot at him at a lower cost. So you see that more in salary cap league, but I like the idea of using that in the UFA auctions. I usually don't have enough money at that point. I usually spend all my money like I did this time.
There you go. Okay, last thing that I forgot to hit on, and I think this is pretty universal, but do you think that there is any way to, with the waiver wire, I feel like in most contract leagues, the waiver wire is always ending up being a 1-year deal. And I think that the only real way to do it is that 1-year deal, but could you see a possibility of implementing a contract league where you could pick a player off waivers and then assign a contract without that being a huge headache for the commissioner?
I don't know of a way, off the top of my head. I mean, I would love a system where you could bid not only the blind bid amount, but the years as well. So I might bid 50 for 3 years and you bid 50 for 1 year and I would get the player. I would love that type of system. I don't think that's supported on MFL where I play my leagues, but yeah, that's kind of pie in the sky dream.
Sure. And that does similarly relate to, we both have played on RSO a couple of times, and their auctions are based on that, where like if that's not the waiver wire, but in terms of like their startup auction or rookie auctions, you offer the player a 3-year deal, and if someone offers a 4-year deal, the player is more likely to, quote unquote, accept the deal. So that is an interesting wrinkle, but it often requires a lot more complexities than you might think. Yeah. All right. That should wrap us up for today. Thanks so much for coming on, Ryan, and talking some contract leagues. Really appreciate it. Any last words on contracts or anything to plug before you head out?
I would just say, I feel like before I joined a contract league, before I joined even an auction league, I was honestly a little intimidated by those. I just kind of played your typical dynasty leagues. And so it took me a long time to actually come around, but they've become my favorite league. So I would just say, if you're not in a contract league, not in an auction league, you should give it a try.
I agree. And if you are a person who's thinking about commissioning one, I would advise against it unless you played one. But, we fly by the seat of our pants, us commissioners.
That's right.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll talk to you guys next week.